Some people enter a castle searching for shelter. Others enter without realizing they are about to change the fate of the man living inside it. Rain hammered against the narrow carriage windows as Clara Whitmore pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her trembling body. The driver had abandoned her nearly half a mile back when the muddy road became impossible for the horses to cross. Now she walked alone through the storm, her small suitcase dragging against the soaked ground while cold wind clawed through the dark forest surrounding Blackmere Castle. Lightning flashed above the cliffs, illuminating the massive estate perched against the night sky, like something carved from shadow and grief. Clara stopped for a moment at the rusted iron gates, struggling to catch her breath. Water dripped from strands of chestnut hair onto her pale cheeks. Her boots were ruined, her fingers numb. Inside the suitcase rested everything she still owned in this world. 2 dresses, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a folded recommendation letter already stained by rain. The enormous gates creaked open slowly as an elderly groundskeeper stepped forward holding a lantern. Its weak golden light barely pierced the storm. His tired eyes narrowed the moment he saw her standing there. "We are not taking visitors tonight," he said sharply above the wind. Clara swallowed the ache in her throat. "Please, sir. I was told the castle needed a governess or house assistant. I came from Thornfield Crossing. I have nowhere else to go." The old man glanced toward the castle with visible discomfort before lowering his voice. "You should leave before he sees you." Clara frowned. "The Duke." The groundskeeper hesitated only a second before nodding. Even speaking about Sebastian Ravensheim seemed to darken the air around them. Everyone across the northern counties knew his name. The widowed duke who had sealed himself inside Blackmere Castle after his wife's death 5 years earlier. The man who no longer attended royal gatherings. The man servants whispered about in frightened voices beside candlelit kitchens. Some claimed grief had hollowed him into a ghost. Others believed something far worse haunted the halls of Blackmere. A distant clap of thunder rolled through the mountains as Clara tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. "Please," she whispered again. "I only need work." The groundskeeper looked almost pitying now. "No girl ever lasts long here." Before Clara could answer, the massive front doors of the castle slowly opened behind him. Warm candlelight spilled across the stone courtyard in trembling gold ribbons. Every servant nearby immediately lowered their heads. Silence swept across the entrance like a cold tide. Then he appeared. Duke Sebastian Ravensheim descended the black marble steps with measured calm, one gloved hand resting against the railing. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in dark wool despite the storm. Rain touched his raven hair, but he seemed untouched by the cold itself. His gray eyes settled on Clara with unreadable stillness. Not curiosity, not kindness. Something quieter, more dangerous. Like a man who had forgotten how to feel surprised by another human being. Clara suddenly became aware of how small she looked standing there drenched beside her battered suitcase. Sebastian's gaze dropped briefly toward the worn leather case, tied together with fraying rope. "That is all you brought?" he asked quietly. His voice carried effortlessly through the storm. Clara nodded once. "Yes, Your Grace." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Rain struck the stone courtyard. Wind rattled the iron gates behind her. Somewhere inside the castle, an old clock echoed through the darkness. Sebastian continued staring at the suitcase as though it disturbed him more than her presence itself. Then finally, without looking at the groundskeeper, he spoke. "Let her inside." The servants exchanged startled glances immediately. Clara did not understand why. But as she stepped past the towering doors of Blackmere Castle, she failed to notice the way Sebastian remained standing in the rain behind her, watching the small suitcase disappear into the shadows of his home with an expression that looked almost painfully familiar. The warmth inside Blackmere Castle should have comforted Clara Whitmore after the freezing storm outside. Yet the moment the enormous doors closed behind her, she felt something colder than winter settle over the house. Silence, heavy and endless. The kind that lived too long inside stone walls. A maid hurried forward to take Clara's soaked coat, but her nervous hands trembled as though even speaking too loudly might awaken something sleeping within the castle. Candlelight flickered across towering corridors lined with dark portraits whose eyes seemed to follow every step. Somewhere deep inside the estate, an ancient clock ticked with slow mechanical precision. Clara tightened her fingers around the handle of her suitcase as the maid guided her through the grand entrance hall. She noticed immediately that half the chandeliers remained unlit despite the late hour. White sheets covered entire rows of furniture like ghosts waiting patiently beneath dust. At the far end of the staircase hung a massive portrait hidden beneath black fabric. Not forgotten. Hidden deliberately. "This way, miss," the maid whispered quickly. Clara glanced toward the covered portrait. "Who is she?" The maid froze for half a heartbeat before lowering her voice further. "The Duchess." No other explanation followed. Clara understood immediately that questions were dangerous here. They climbed 2 flights of winding stairs until the maid opened a small bedroom tucked into the east wing of the castle. The room was modest compared to the grandeur below, but clean and warm. A fire crackled softly inside the marble hearth. Fresh towels rested beside the bed. Clara stared at them in quiet surprise. Someone had prepared this room before she arrived. As though the Duke had known she would stay the moment, he looked at her standing in the rain. "Dinner will be brought shortly," the maid said while avoiding eye contact. "His Grace does not like unnecessary noise after dark." Clara nodded gently. "Thank you." The maid hesitated near the doorway. "Miss Whitmore." Clara looked up. "Do not wander after midnight." The door closed before Clara could ask why. Alone now, she slowly placed her battered suitcase at the foot of the bed. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and old books. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking endless black forest below the cliffs. Clara opened the suitcase carefully, smoothing her mother's Bible with tired fingertips before placing it beside the bed. She should have felt relief. Instead, unease lingered beneath her ribs. The castle felt frozen in time, not abandoned. Waiting. Nearly an hour later, unable to sleep, Clara stepped quietly into the corridor holding the candle left beside her door. The hall stretched endlessly beneath dim golden light. Every floorboard seemed to sigh beneath her careful footsteps. Then she saw it. At the far end of the corridor stood Duke Sebastian Ravensheir, completely motionless beside a tall window overlooking the storm. His back faced her. One gloved hand rested against the glass, while rainwater streaked down the dark night beyond. Clara should have turned around immediately. Every instinct warned her to retreat silently. But something about the loneliness in his posture rooted her in place. Not the loneliness of a powerful man. The loneliness of someone who had once loved this castle and no longer remembered how. Suddenly Sebastian spoke without turning toward her. "Most people cannot sleep their first night here." Clara's breath caught softly. His voice sounded quieter tonight. More tired. She lowered her candle slightly. "I did not mean to disturb you, Your Grace." Sebastian finally turned. Shadows flickered across his sharp features while his gray eyes settled calmly on her face. There was no anger there. Only exhaustion buried beneath years of careful control. His gaze moved briefly toward the small candle trembling in her hand. "The storms are worse during winter," he said quietly. "Blackmere has a way of making strangers feel trapped." Clara hesitated before answering. "It does not feel trapped to me." Something unreadable crossed his expression then. Something almost startled. The clock downstairs echoed through the castle once. Twice. Sebastian looked at her for another long moment before speaking again. "You should get some rest, Miss Whitmore." Clara nodded softly and stepped backward toward her room. But before she closed the door behind her, she glanced once more toward the end of the corridor. The Duke had not moved. Still standing beside the dark window. Still alone. Morning arrived beneath a ceiling of iron-gray clouds that swallowed nearly all sunlight above Blackmere Castle. Clara Whitmore woke to the faint crackling of dying embers in the hearth and the distant sound of wind brushing against ancient stone walls. For several quiet seconds she forgot where she was. Then the silence returned. Heavy. Watching. She dressed quickly in her plain blue wool dress and braided her damp chestnut hair before stepping into the corridor. The castle seemed even larger in daylight, though little warmth reached its endless halls. Tall windows revealed forests drowned beneath fog, while dust floated lazily through pale ribbons of morning light. Somewhere below, a clock struck 8 times. Clara followed the sound of voices downstairs until she reached the servants' hall, where several maids and footmen immediately fell silent upon seeing her enter. Their eyes moved toward one another with visible unease. The older housekeeper from the previous evening finally stepped forward. Mrs. Holloway carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent decades maintaining order inside a place determined to remain frozen in grief. "You may assist with the East Wing today," she said briskly. "The rooms have not been properly cleaned in some time." Clara nodded politely. "Of course." One of the younger maids hesitated before blurting nervously, "No one likes working in the East Wing." Mrs. Holloway shot the girl a sharp look that silenced her immediately. Clara noticed it anyway. Fear lived inside this household like another servant. Quiet. Constant. By mid-morning, Clara found herself alone beneath towering ceilings draped in shadows and silence. The East Wing smelled faintly of dust, extinguished fireplaces, and old roses long since dead. White sheets covered nearly every piece of furniture, while dark portraits lined the walls beneath layers of neglect. Yet beneath the decay, she could still see traces of extraordinary beauty. Hand-carved banisters, crystal sconces, marble floors imported from Italy decades earlier. Someone had once loved this place deeply. Clara paused beside a large window overlooking the cliffs and noticed a vase filled with brittle dead flowers resting on a side table nearby. Without thinking, she removed them carefully and opened the nearby window several inches. Cold air rushed instantly into the corridor, carrying the scent of pine and rain. The curtains stirred softly for the first time in years. Clara closed her eyes briefly, breathing in fresh air instead of dust and sorrow. Then she carried the dead flowers away. An hour later, she discovered an enormous grandfather clock standing motionless near the ballroom entrance. Its hands remained frozen at exactly 10:17. Dust blanketed the carved wood frame. Clara tilted her head thoughtfully before kneeling beside the mechanism. "You deserve better than this," she murmured softly. After several careful adjustments and more patience than strength, the ancient gears suddenly groaned alive. Tick, tick, tick. The sound echoed through the corridor like a heartbeat returning to life. Clara smiled despite herself, until a cold voice shattered the silence behind her. "Who gave you permission to touch that clock?" Clara stood immediately, turning to find Sebastian Ravensheyer watching her from the opposite end of the corridor. He wore black gloves again today, his dark coat severe against the pale light filtering through the windows. Yet it was not anger in his expression that unsettled her most. It was shock. Real shock. Clara lowered her hands carefully. "I apologize, Your Grace." It was broken. Sebastian's gaze shifted slowly toward the clock, whose steady ticking now filled the hall between them. The sound seemed to tighten something invisible inside him. It was not meant to run. Clara frowned faintly. "Why?" For a long moment he said nothing. Wind whispered through the partially open window nearby. Then his eyes moved toward the fresh air, stirring the curtains, toward the absence of dead flowers, toward the faint traces of life returning to a corridor that had been untouched for years. Something unreadable darkened his features. "Close the window," he said quietly. Clara obeyed at once. The curtains stilled. Silence returned. But the clock continued, ticking steadily between them. Sebastian stared at it another moment before looking back at Clara with unsettling intensity. "You should not change things inside this castle, Miss Whitmore." Clara swallowed softly, yet lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "Perhaps some things have been waiting to change for a very long time." The words escaped before caution could stop them. Immediately, the corridor grew still enough to hear the storm outside, gathering once more over the cliffs. Sebastian did not answer. But for the first time since Clara arrived at Blackmere Castle, the Duke looked at her not as a temporary servant, but as someone dangerous to the grief he had spent years protecting. That evening, the storm returned with renewed fury, rattling the towering windows of Blackmere Castle hard enough to make the candle flames tremble along the walls. Clara Whitmore stood beside the small mirror in her room, smoothing the wrinkles from her plain dark green dress, while nervousness twisted quietly beneath her ribs. Mrs. Holloway had appeared an hour earlier with unexpected instructions. One of the senior servants had fallen ill, leaving no one available to oversee the Duke's evening meal. Clara would assist in the dining room instead. "Speak only if spoken to," Mrs. Holloway warned while adjusting the silver tray in Clara's hands. "And whatever happens, do not mention the Duchess." Clara had nodded politely, though the warning lingered heavily in her thoughts long after the housekeeper disappeared. Now she followed the dim corridor downstairs while distant thunder rolled through the mountains beyond the cliffs. The dining hall of Blackmere Castle looked less like a place for meals and more like a cathedral built for silence. A fireplace crackled beneath carved stone arches while dozens of candles cast golden light across a table long enough to seat 30 guests. Tonight, only one chair was occupied. Sebastian Ravensheyer sat near the far end dressed entirely in black, one gloved hand resting beside an untouched glass of wine. The vast emptiness surrounding him felt deliberate, like punishment. Clara quietly placed the silver tray before him before stepping back into the shadows as instructed. Sebastian barely glanced toward her. "You are replacing Mr. Callow tonight?" he asked calmly. "Yes, Your Grace." His gray eyes lifted briefly toward her face. "Most servants avoid this room after dark." Clara hesitated carefully before answering. Perhaps they mistake silence for danger. Something flickered across his expression. Not amusement exactly, but close enough to surprise that Clara noticed it immediately. Sebastian looked back toward the fire. "And you do not?" Clara folded her hands before her. "No, Your Grace." Another stretch of silence followed. Rain battered the windows. Somewhere deeper inside the castle, the grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, no longer frozen at 10:17. Sebastian reached for the wine glass, but paused midway. "You repaired the clock this morning," he said quietly. It was not a question. Clara nodded once. "Yes." "Why?" She searched for the right answer. "Because abandoned things deserve to breathe again." The words settled heavily between them. Sebastian slowly lowered the untouched glass back onto the table. Firelight flickered across the sharp angles of his face, while shadows gathered beneath his tired eyes. Clara suddenly understood that this man had spent years surrounded by people too frightened to speak honestly in his presence. Yet honesty itself seemed to disturb him more than silence ever could. Dinner continued quietly after that. Clara remained near the wall, while Sebastian forced himself through only a few bites of food. But gradually the tension inside the room shifted into something stranger. Less like fear, more like two lonely people listening carefully for cracks in each other's armor. At one point, a sudden gust of wind swept through the chimney, causing several candles to flicker violently. Clara glanced toward the storm outside. "The weather reminds me of northern Vermont," she said softly before thinking better of it. Sebastian looked up immediately. "You have been there?" "When I was a child. My father repaired pianos for wealthy families during the winters." Sebastian's gaze sharpened slightly. "Pianos?" Clara nodded. "He used to say instruments remember sadness longer than people do." The Duke went perfectly still. Even the fire seemed quieter. Clara instantly regretted speaking. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to overstep." But Sebastian did not answer right away. His eyes had drifted toward the far corner of the dining hall, where an enormous piano sat beneath a white cloth untouched by time. Dust covered the bench. No one had played it in years. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded lower somehow, more distant. "My wife used to play every evening during storms." Clara's breath caught softly. There it was, the ghost haunting Blackmere Castle finally stepping into the room between them. Sebastian stared toward the covered piano another long moment before abruptly standing from the table. The chair scraped sharply against marble floors. "That will be all tonight, Miss Whitmore." Clara lowered her eyes respectfully. "Yes, Your Grace." He crossed the room without another word, his dark figure disappearing into the corridor shadows beyond the candlelight. But just before he vanished completely, Clara noticed something that unsettled her more than his silence ever had. For the first time since she arrived at Blackmere Castle, Sebastian Ravensheyer looked less like a man protecting his grief, and more like a man terrified it might finally begin slipping away from him. The storm worsened after midnight. Wind roared through the cliffs surrounding Blackmere Castle hard enough to shake the tall windows inside Clara Whitmore's room. Sleep refused to come. She lay awake listening to the endless howl of rain against stone, while distant thunder rolled across the mountains like something restless wandering the dark. Then suddenly the lights vanished. Every candle in the corridor outside flickered out at once. The castle fell into complete darkness. Clara sat upright immediately as silence swallowed the room. A moment later came the sound of hurried footsteps and nervous voices echoing faintly below. Somewhere downstairs a servant cried out before being quickly hushed. Clara grabbed the small candle beside her bed and lit it carefully with trembling fingers. The weak flame revealed only shadows pressing against the walls. She stepped into the corridor cautiously. The east wing stretched endlessly before her, darker now than she had ever seen it. Rain lashed against the windows hard enough to sound like scattered pebbles striking glass. Clara moved slowly through the hall searching for another servant or at least some explanation for the sudden blackout. But the deeper she walked, the quieter the castle became. Too quiet. Then lightning flashed beyond the windows. For one brief second, she saw a narrow doorway standing partially open near the far end of the corridor. Warm candlelight flickered faintly from inside. Clara hesitated. Every warning she had received since arriving at Blackmere whispered through her thoughts. Do not wander after midnight. Do not ask about the Duchess. Do not change things inside the castle. Yet something pulled her toward that open door anyway. Slowly Clara stepped closer until she reached the threshold. Her breath caught immediately. The room beyond looked untouched by time itself. Moonlight filtered through tall curtains onto pale furniture covered in delicate lace. Fresh white roses rested inside crystal vases despite the storm outside. An elegant silver hairbrush sat atop the vanity beside a bottle of perfume long evaporated into memory. Everything inside the room felt painfully alive compared to the rest of Blackmere Castle, as though someone still waited here. Clara stepped carefully inside. At the far wall hung a portrait uncovered at last. The Duchess. Clara stared quietly at the painted woman with soft golden hair and kind blue eyes frozen forever in gentle laughter. Not cold beauty. Warmth. The kind capable of transforming entire rooms simply by entering them. Clara suddenly understood why Sebastian Ravensheim had buried this wing beneath silence and shadows for 5 years. This room still belonged to a ghost he could not release. A sharp sound behind her shattered the stillness. Clara turned instantly. Sebastian stood in the doorway. His face had gone completely pale beneath the flickering candlelight. Rainwater darkened his coat and strands of wet black hair clung to his forehead as though he had searched the castle during the storm itself. But it was his eyes that unsettled her most. Not anger. Panic. Raw and unguarded. What are you doing here? His voice struck the room, low and dangerous. Clara instinctively stepped backward. I am sorry, Your Grace. The lights went out, and I saw the door open. I did not realize. You should not be in this room. The words came sharper this time. Clara lowered her candle slightly. I meant no disrespect. Sebastian crossed the distance between them abruptly before stopping only a few feet away. The storm outside raged violently around the castle, while shadows flickered across his rigid expression. Clara could see now that one of his black gloves was missing. Burn scars twisted across part of his right hand, disappearing beneath his sleeve, like pale lightning trapped beneath skin. Sebastian noticed her gaze instantly and clenched his hand closed. Shame darkened his features so quickly it almost hurt to witness. Clara lifted her eyes back to his face at once. She did not pity him. Somehow that seemed to affect him more than fear ever could. For several heavy seconds neither spoke. Then Clara looked slowly around the room once more. You kept everything exactly the same, she whispered gently. Sebastian stared at her with exhausted stillness. Because she was the only beautiful thing this castle ever had. Clara's chest tightened unexpectedly at the quiet devastation beneath those words. Outside, thunder cracked across the cliffs again. But inside the room something far more dangerous shifted between them. Because for the first time since his wife's death, Sebastian Ravensheim had allowed another person to stand inside the center of his grief, and he had not asked her to leave. The storm finally weakened near dawn, leaving Blackmere Castle wrapped in a cold silver fog that drifted across the cliffs like restless spirits. Clara Whitmore had not slept. The memory of Sebastian Ravensheim standing inside his late wife's room with rain in his hair and grief in his eyes followed her through the remaining hours of darkness like a whispered secret. By morning the servants moved through the halls more nervously than usual. Word had already spread that someone had entered the Duchess's chambers for the first time in years and somehow survived the Duke's anger. Clara noticed the glances immediately. Curiosity, suspicion, fear. Yet no one dared question her directly. She spent most of the morning organizing books inside the neglected library, while weak winter sunlight filtered through towering windows coated with frost. Dust danced through pale beams of light each time she opened another forgotten volume. The library itself felt different from the rest of the castle. less haunted, more abandoned. As though Sebastian had once loved this room before grief hollowed everything around him. Clara carefully stacked several worn journals onto a nearby table when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quietly. Sebastian stood near the entrance holding a pair of black leather gloves in one hand. He looked exhausted. Not physically, something deeper. The exhaustion of a man who had spent too many years fighting memories stronger than sleep. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them no longer felt entirely uncomfortable. Sebastian's gaze drifted toward the books surrounding her. Most people avoid this room as well, he said finally. Clara brushed dust from her fingertips. That seems to happen often inside this castle. A faint shadow of something almost resembling amusement touched his expression before vanishing again. He walked slowly toward one of the tall windows overlooking the frozen cliffs. Snow still clung to the black rocks below, while fog swallowed the forests in every direction. Clara noticed immediately that he was not wearing his gloves now. The scars along his right hand remained visible beneath the pale winter light, twisted remnants of a fire long past. Yet Sebastian made no effort to hide them today. That alone felt strangely important. You looked at my hand differently than most people do, he said quietly without turning toward her. Clara hesitated carefully before answering. Because scars are not frightening to me, Your Grace. Sebastian lowered his eyes briefly toward the damaged skin stretched across his fingers. They should be. The words settled heavily inside the library. Clara studied him quietly. Were you burned trying to save her? Sebastian's jaw tightened instantly. For several long seconds Clara thought he might leave without answering. But instead he stared through the frost-covered window and spoke in a voice so low it almost disappeared beneath the crackling fireplace nearby. The fire began in the West Wing during a winter storm much like this one. Everyone escaped except Evelyn. Clara recognized the Duchess's name for the first time. Evelyn. Somehow hearing it aloud made the castle feel even quieter. Sebastian swallowed once before continuing. I reached her room too late. His scarred hand closed slowly into a fist. Afterward people called me fortunate for surviving. Bitterness darkened his voice. I never agreed with them. Clara felt something ache softly inside her chest. Not pity. Recognition. She knew what it meant to survive something that left part of you buried beside another person forever. She stepped closer carefully. Not enough to intrude. Just enough to let him know he was no longer speaking into emptiness. Pain kept alive too long becomes a prison, she said softly. Sebastian turned toward her then. Truly turned. His gray eyes searched her face with unsettling intensity, as though trying to understand how someone who arrived at Blackmere Castle carrying nothing but a broken suitcase could speak directly into wounds he had hidden from the world for years. You speak as though you understand grief very well, Miss Whitmore. Clara lowered her gaze briefly. My mother died during the influenza outbreak 3 winters ago. My father followed 6 months later. She forced a faint smile that carried no joy. After enough loss, silence begins feeling safer than hope. Something shifted in Sebastian's expression at those words. Not the sharp pain Clara had glimpsed before. Something quieter. Recognition. Outside the library windows, snow drifted softly across the cliffs while the grandfather clock downstairs continued its steady rhythm through the castle halls. Tick, tick, tick. Life moving forward whether broken hearts wished it to or not. Sebastian stared at Clara another long moment before speaking again. Most people look at me and see the Duke. His voice had gone rough around the edges somehow. You look at me as though I am simply a man who is tired. Clara met his gaze steadily. Perhaps because you are. Silence settled between them once more. But this time it no longer felt cold. Snow fell quietly over Blackmere Castle that evening, covering the cliffs and frozen gardens beneath a pale silver veil that made the entire estate appear suspended between memory and dream. Inside, most of the servants had long since retired to their quarters while the last fireplaces burned low beneath towering stone hearths. Yet Clara Whitmore remained awake. She sat alone inside the library wrapped in a wool shawl with an open book resting forgotten in her lap. Her thoughts had wandered too often throughout the evening to follow the words before her. Again and again she found herself remembering the look in Sebastian Ravenshire's eyes earlier that day. Not the grief itself, the exhaustion beneath it. The terrible loneliness of someone who no longer knew what to do with kindness once it appeared before him. The castle had grown quieter over the past week. Not emptier. Softer somehow. The grandfather clock continued ticking steadily through the halls. Fresh flowers now appeared beside several windows each morning. Even Mrs. Holloway no longer walked the corridors with the expression of someone expecting disaster at every turn. Clara closed the book gently and rose from the chair. A faint sound drifted through the silence just then. Music, soft and distant. Piano keys, trembling somewhere deep within the castle. Clara froze immediately. The melody carried through the halls like something fragile awakening after years buried beneath dust and sorrow. She followed the sound almost without thinking. Candlelight flickered along the corridor walls while the music grew clearer with each step. Sad, beautiful, the kind of melody that belonged to winter evenings and unfinished goodbyes. Clara finally reached the ballroom entrance and stopped breathlessly at the doorway. The enormous piano stood uncovered at last beneath the golden chandelier light. Clara stared in quiet disbelief before slowly approaching the instrument. Her fingertips brushed lightly across the polished black wood. Someone had cleaned away years of dust. The keys beneath her hands felt cold but alive. She sat carefully upon the bench. My father used to say instruments remember sadness longer than people do. She whispered softly into the empty room. Then she began to play. The melody flowed gently through the ballroom, filling the vast silence of Blackmere Castle with something it had not known for many years. Warmth. Clara closed her eyes briefly as the music carried her away from grief, from loneliness, from the ache of surviving too many winters alone. She did not notice the figure standing motionless in the shadows beyond the ballroom doors. Sebastian Ravensheyer had heard the first notes from the far end of the west corridor and followed them instinctively before he could stop himself. Now he stood hidden beneath darkness listening to the exact piece Evelyn once played during storms. His chest tightened so sharply it almost stole his breath. For one impossible moment the castle sounded alive again. Not haunted. Alive. Clara continued playing softly, unaware of the man watching her from the shadows with gray eyes filled by memories too heavy for words. Firelight flickered across Sebastian's face while his scarred hand rested tightly against the doorway frame. He should have walked away immediately. The music hurt too much. It reached places inside him he had spent 5 years trying to bury beneath silence and routine and grief. Yet he could not move, because the sound no longer belonged entirely to the past. Somehow Clara had transformed the melody into something gentler, less like mourning, more like survival. Then suddenly the final notes faded into silence. Clara opened her eyes slowly and sensed him before she saw him. She turned toward the doorway. Sebastian remained standing in shadow, tall and motionless, his expression unreadable except for the unmistakable emotion flickering behind his guarded eyes. Clara rose immediately from the piano bench. I am sorry, Your Grace. I should not have touched it without permission. Sebastian said nothing at first. His gaze drifted toward the piano keys still, trembling faintly beneath candlelight. Then finally he spoke. Evelyn played that piece every winter. Clara lowered her eyes gently. It is beautiful. Sebastian stared at her for a long moment that felt strangely intimate despite the distance between them. No one has played inside this room since she died. The words settled heavily through the ballroom. Clara suddenly understood what this moment truly meant. She had not merely disturbed the silence of Blackmere Castle. She had stepped directly into the center of his grief again. Yet Sebastian did not ask her to stop. Instead, he slowly crossed the ballroom toward the piano while snow drifted softly beyond the towering windows. When he finally stopped beside her, close enough for Clara to hear the unevenness hidden beneath his breathing, he looked not at the instrument, but at her. And for the first time since she arrived at Blackmere Castle, Clara saw something dangerous breaking through the Duke's carefully guarded sorrow. Hope. 3 days after the music returned to Blackmere Castle, the first carriage arrived at the estate since winter began. Clara Whitmore stood beside the library window watching black horses pull an elegant silver carriage through the snow-covered gates while unease settled quietly inside her chest. Mrs. Holloway had informed the household that several neighboring aristocrats would be visiting for supper that evening. The announcement alone had transformed the castle into controlled chaos. Servants rushed through corridors carrying silver trays and candle stands while fireplaces blazed throughout rooms untouched for years. Yet beneath the activity, Clara sensed another emotion moving quietly through the staff. Anxiety, as though outsiders brought danger with them. By dusk, Blackmere Castle glowed beneath hundreds of candles reflected against tall windows overlooking the frozen cliffs. Clara adjusted the sleeves of her simple dark blue dress before descending the staircase toward the dining hall. Mrs. Holloway had insisted she assist with the evening service personally. The Duke requested it, the housekeeper admitted earlier with visible confusion. Clara still did not know what unsettled her more, the request itself, or how quickly her pulse betrayed her at hearing it. Voices drifted through the grand hall as she approached. Refined laughter, crystal glasses clinking softly, the sharp, polished tones of wealthy people accustomed to being admired wherever they entered. Clara stepped carefully inside, carrying a silver tray, only to feel several conversations immediately falter around her. For guests stood near the fireplace, speaking with Sebastian Ravensheyer. Two older gentlemen in tailored coats, a younger countess draped in emerald silk, and beside her Lady Beatrice Ashford, widow of a powerful northern family, and perhaps the most beautiful woman Clara had ever seen. Tall, elegant, perfectly composed beneath strands of pearls shimmering against pale skin. Yet the moment Lady Beatrice noticed Clara crossing the room, something cold entered her smile. "How unusual," she said lightly while accepting a glass of wine from Clara's tray. Blackmere finally employs servants young enough to belong in ballrooms. The others chuckled softly. Clara lowered her eyes politely. "Excuse me, my lady." But Lady Beatrice was not finished. Her gaze drifted lazily over Clara's plain dress and simple hairstyle. Although perhaps not this ballroom. Silence settled sharply around the fireplace. Clara felt heat rise painfully beneath her skin, yet forced herself to remain calm. She had survived humiliation before. Poverty taught women quickly how invisible dignity must become to survive. One of the gentlemen smirked faintly. "Sebastian, surely the girl belongs downstairs with the rest of the staff." Clara tightened her fingers against the silver tray. The room waited. She could feel it. Everyone watching the Duke carefully now, waiting to see whether he would ignore the insult or quietly allow it. Sebastian remained completely still beside the fireplace, one gloved hand resting against the marble mantel. His gray eyes moved slowly from the guests toward Clara standing alone beneath the candlelight. For one long, unbearable moment, he said nothing. Then Sebastian crossed the room. Every conversation stopped instantly. Clara's breath caught softly as he approached her with calm, measured steps. Not hurried, not angry, certain. When he finally stopped beside her, the warmth radiating from his presence unsettled her more than the cruel laughter moments earlier. Sebastian took the silver tray gently from her trembling hands and passed it to a nearby servant without breaking eye contact. Then before the entire room, he offered Clara his arm. Gasps flickered through the hall. Lady Beatrice's smile vanished completely. Sebastian's voice remained quiet when he finally spoke, but the authority beneath it silenced every heartbeat inside the room. "Miss Whitmore stays where I decide she stays." Clara stared at him speechlessly. No one moved. No one dared challenge him. The Duke of Blackmere had just defended a penniless governess in front of northern aristocracy, as though her presence beside him required no explanation at all. Sebastian lowered his gaze briefly toward Clara. "Walk with me." She hesitated only a second before placing her hand lightly against his arm. Together they crossed the grand hall beneath stunned silence, while chandeliers flickered overhead and snow drifted beyond the towering windows. Clara could feel every pair of eyes following them. Yet strangely, for the first time since arriving at Blackmere Castle, she no longer felt small. Because beside her walked a man who had spent 5 years avoiding the world, and had just chosen her over its approval without hesitation. The snowstorm passed during the night, leaving Blackmere Castle wrapped beneath a strange and fragile calm. Clara Whitmore stood alone the following morning inside the east corridor, watching pale winter sunlight spill across marble floors for the first time in days. Yet despite the quiet beauty surrounding her, unease lingered beneath her ribs. The events of the previous evening had already spread through the household like wildfire. Servants whispered when she passed. Footmen suddenly lowered their eyes with unusual respect. Even Mrs. Holloway watched Clara now with the cautious expression of someone witnessing something impossible unfold in slow motion. Because everyone inside Blackmere Castle understood the same dangerous truth. Sebastian Ravensheir had chosen to stand beside her publicly, and men like the Duke did not do such things carelessly. Clara tried avoiding him throughout the morning, not because she feared him. That fear had vanished days ago. What unsettled her now was something far more dangerous. The way her heart betrayed her whenever his footsteps echoed nearby. The way silence changed whenever he entered a room. The way loneliness itself seemed less heavy when he looked at her. She carried fresh linens toward the west wing shortly before noon when she noticed one of the old study doors standing slightly open. Strange. Mrs. Holloway had insisted those rooms remained locked at all times. Clara hesitated briefly before stepping closer. Dust drifted through pale sunlight inside the forgotten office beyond. Shelves overflowed with ledgers and unopened correspondence, while a cold fireplace sat buried beneath years of ash. Yet one object immediately drew her attention, a small wooden box resting alone upon the desk. Clara approached carefully. Something about the box felt personal. Protected. She should have walked away immediately. Instead, she lifted the lid. Inside rested a stack of letters tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. Evelyn's letters. Clara recognized the elegant handwriting at once from notes displayed inside the Duchess's room. Her breath caught softly as she reached for the top envelope. Most remained unopened, untouched, but one letter sat separately beneath the others, sealed with dark wax bearing Evelyn's initials. Across the front, in graceful trembling script, were 5 simple words. For Sebastian. Only if needed. Clara stared at the envelope in confusion. Why would Sebastian preserve a final letter from his wife, yet never open it? Before she could think further, footsteps echoed suddenly behind her. Clara turned sharply. Sebastian stood motionless in the doorway. His expression hardened instantly the moment he saw the open box resting before her. Clara stepped back at once. Your Grace, I apologize. The door was open, and I did not mean to intrude. Sebastian crossed the room slowly, his gaze fixed entirely upon the letter still resting in her hands. Clara noticed immediately how pale he had become. You should not touch those, he said quietly. Not angry. Worse. Wounded. Clara carefully placed the envelope back inside the box. I did not read it. Sebastian stopped beside the desk. Silence thickened around them while snowmelt dripped softly beyond the tall windows outside. Clara looked toward the unopened letter again. Why have you never opened it? The question escaped before caution could stop it. Sebastian's jaw tightened. His scarred hand closed slowly against the edge of the desk. For several painful seconds he said nothing. Then finally his voice emerged rough and unsteady beneath years of restraint. Because if she blamed me. He stopped. Clara felt her chest tighten softly. Sebastian lowered his gaze toward the sealed envelope as though it carried the power to destroy what little remained of him. I could survive grief, he whispered quietly, but I could not survive knowing she died hating me. The confession settled heavily between them. Clara stared at him with aching understanding. 5 years. 5 years he had carried guilt heavy enough to bury entire parts of himself alive. Yet he had never once gathered the courage to discover whether that guilt was deserved at all. Slowly Clara stepped closer to the desk. Closer to him. Evelyn loved you, she said gently. Sebastian's eyes lifted sharply toward her face. Clara swallowed softly before continuing. You do not preserve a room like hers, or protect memories like these, unless she loved you deeply enough to leave part of herself behind everywhere inside this castle. Sebastian stared at her in silence. The grandfather clock echoed faintly through distant halls. Tick, tick, tick. Then Clara reached carefully toward the unopened letter and placed it into his scarred hand. His fingers trembled instantly beneath the weight of something so small. Perhaps the truth is not waiting to punish you, she whispered. Perhaps it has been waiting all this time to set you free. The letter remained unopened for 2 full days. Clara Whitmore knew because she watched Sebastian Ravensheir carry it with him everywhere afterward like a man carrying both salvation and ruin inside the same folded paper. He kept it tucked inside the pocket of his dark coat during meals, resting near his untouched whiskey glass inside the library at night. Once she even glimpsed him standing beside the frost-covered windows at dawn holding the envelope so tightly his scarred hand trembled against the pale winter light. Yet he still could not open it. Blackmere Castle seemed to hold its breath alongside him. The silence inside the estate no longer felt dead now. Tense perhaps. Waiting. The servants noticed the changes first. Fires burned longer into the evenings. Curtains that had remained closed for years were suddenly opened to weak winter sunlight. The West Conservatory, abandoned since Evelyn's death, was cleaned and aired out under Sebastian's quiet instructions. Even Mrs. Holloway appeared startled each time the Duke requested fresh flowers for the dining hall every morning. Clara noticed something else too. Sebastian had begun sleeping again. The dark exhaustion beneath his eyes softened slightly with each passing day, though grief still lingered inside him like an old wound aching before snowstorms. Yet now there were moments when Clara caught him staring absent-mindedly toward the piano room or pausing beside open windows as though rediscovering the castle itself for the first time in years. One snowy afternoon, Clara found him standing alone inside the conservatory. Sunlight filtered through frosted glass overhead, while pale winter roses climbed slowly back toward life beneath careful restoration. Sebastian stood beside one of the stone planters without his gloves again, his scarred hand brushing lightly across a new bloom. Clara stopped quietly near the doorway. "I did not know flowers could survive winters this harsh," she said softly. Sebastian glanced toward her. Something warm flickered briefly behind his gray eyes at the sight of her standing there. "Evelyn planted these herself," he answered. "She insisted roses were stubborn enough to outlive cold if given patience." Clara stepped farther inside. The conservatory no longer felt abandoned now. The air smelled faintly of earth and cedarwood instead of dust and sorrow. Sunlight painted soft gold across Sebastian's dark coat, while snow drifted quietly beyond the glass ceiling overhead. For one fragile moment, the scene looked less like mourning and more like healing. Sebastian studied the rose beside him silently before speaking again. "I avoided this room after she died." Clara looked toward him gently. "Because it reminded you of her?" His jaw tightened faintly. "Because it reminded me of the man I used to be before I failed her." Clara lowered her gaze briefly toward the unopened letter still visible inside his coat pocket. "Perhaps that is why you cannot open the letter," she said quietly. Sebastian stared at her carefully now. "And why is that?" Clara hesitated only a second. "Because if Evelyn forgave you," her voice softened further, "then you would no longer know who to blame for all these years of pain." The truth of the words settled heavily between them. Sebastian looked away immediately toward the snow-covered gardens beyond the glass. Clara could almost see the battle unfolding behind his eyes. A man who had built his entire existence around guilt suddenly standing at the edge of freedom without knowing whether he could survive it. Then unexpectedly Sebastian laughed once under his breath. Not with humor, with disbelief. "You have a dangerous habit of seeing through people, Miss Whitmore." Clara smiled faintly. "Only the lonely ones." Silence returned gently afterward. Not cold, not strained, comfortable. Sebastian looked toward her again then, really looked, and Clara suddenly became aware of how close they now stood inside the quiet warmth of the conservatory. Close enough to notice the silver strands hidden near his temples. Close enough to see the exhaustion slowly leaving his face day by day. Close enough to understand that somewhere between snowstorms and silence and grief, this castle had begun teaching both of them how to breathe again. Sebastian's voice lowered when he finally spoke. "Blackmere feels different since you arrived." Clara's pulse stumbled softly beneath her ribs. "Different how?" He held her gaze for several long seconds before answering. "Less empty." The words settled into the quiet conservatory, like something fragile and terrifying all at once. Because Clara suddenly understood the dangerous truth neither of them had spoken aloud yet. Sebastian Ravensheim was no longer merely surviving her presence inside his castle. He was beginning to need it. Winter sunlight spilled softly through the tall windows of Blackmere Castle the next morning, casting pale gold across corridors that no longer felt entirely haunted. Clara Whitmore noticed the changes everywhere now. Servants laughed quietly in kitchens once ruled by silence. Fresh wood crackled inside fireplaces long abandoned. Even the frozen gardens beyond the cliffs seemed less lifeless beneath the steady care Sebastian Ravensheim had begun giving the estate again. Yet despite the warmth slowly returning to the castle, Clara herself felt increasingly uneasy, because people were beginning to notice. It started with whispers among visiting merchants in town. Then came lingering glances from neighboring families. By the end of the week, Even Mrs. Holloway gently warned Clara while arranging flowers in the dining hall. "People are talking, miss." Clara kept her eyes lowered toward the roses. "About what?" The older woman hesitated carefully. "About why His Grace no longer avoids supper. Why the ballroom lights burn again. Why he walks through the gardens every evening." Her voice softened. "And why he always seems to be looking for you." Clara's hands stilled instantly against the vase. Outside the windows, snow drifted peacefully across the cliffs, while something heavier settled inside her chest. She had known this moment would come eventually. Men like Sebastian Ravensheim belonged to a world she could never enter without consequences. The Duke could survive whispers. A governess could not. That evening another letter arrived from Lady Beatrice Ashford. Clara discovered it resting upon the small table inside her room after supper. No signature was necessary. The message itself carried enough cruelty. "Women like you destroy grieving men because you mistake pity for love. Leave before Blackmere buries another woman inside its walls." Clara stared at the letter for a very long time. Her fingers trembled, slightly though her expression remained calm. Lady Beatrice was wrong about many things. Clara did not pity Sebastian. What frightened her was something far more dangerous. She loved him. Quietly. Completely. And perhaps that was precisely why she needed to leave. Hours later, the castle slept beneath another soft snowfall, while Clara folded her few belongings carefully inside the same battered suitcase she had carried through the storm weeks earlier. 2 dresses. Her mother's Bible. Nothing more. The room felt painfully small now compared to the ache spreading through her chest. She paused beside the window, overlooking the frozen cliffs. Somewhere deep below, the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm through the sleeping castle halls. Tick, tick, is beginning to breathe again. Her voice trembled slightly. "And I do not wish to become the reason the world turns cruel toward you." Sebastian's expression hardened instantly. Not with anger toward her. Toward the thought itself. "I do not care about the world." Clara's pulse stumbled painfully at the quiet certainty beneath his words. She looked away before her composure shattered completely. Trembled slightly in Sebastian's scarred hand as he sat motionless at the edge of the bed. 5 years of guilt. 5 years spent punishing himself for a tragedy Evelyn herself had never blamed him for. And somehow the first person he wanted to find after reading those words was Clara. Sebastian rose immediately and crossed the room with unusual urgency. The castle no longer felt like a prison this morning. It felt unfinished without her in it. He reached the east corridor moments later, only to stop cold outside Clara's room. The door stood partially open. Empty. A terrible stillness spread through him instantly. Sebastian stepped inside slowly. The fireplace had gone dark. The bed neatly made. Her small table bare except for one forgotten ribbon left beside the window. Then his eyes fell toward the missing suitcase space near the wall. His breath caught sharply. No. He crossed the room quickly as though denial alone could change what he already understood. But the silence inside the room told the truth more cruelly than words ever could. Clara was gone. Something inside Sebastian unraveled then. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a man suddenly realizing the warmth returning to his life had vanished while he slept. He descended the staircase with frightening speed, startling servants throughout the halls. Mrs. Holloway nearly dropped the tray in her hands when he appeared in the grand foyer. "Where is Miss Whitmore?" Sebastian demanded. The older woman stared at him in alarm. "She left before sunrise, Your Grace." She said she did not wish to disturb anyone. Disturb anyone. The word struck him like cruelty itself. Sebastian looked toward the front doors where faint traces of Clara's footprints still disappeared beneath fresh snow outside. For several long seconds he could not move. He had survived Evelyn's death only by convincing himself he no longer needed anything capable of leaving him broken again. Yet now panic tightened through his chest with terrifying clarity. Not because Clara had betrayed him. Because she had become necessary before he understood how deeply. Sebastian grabbed his coat from the nearby stand without another word. "Prepare my horse." "Mrs. Holloway blinked in shock. "Your Grace, the roads are dangerous after the storm." But Sebastian was already crossing the courtyard into the snow. Wind tore through his dark coat, while servants rushed behind him in confusion. The black stallion arrived moments later, breathing clouds into the frozen morning air. Sebastian mounted without hesitation. His scarred hand tightened painfully against the reins as only one thought echoed through his mind. Not again. He would not lose another person because fear taught him silence too long. Snow whipped violently across the cliffs as the horse thundered through the castle gates toward the village roads below. Meanwhile, Clara sat alone inside the small railway station nearly 20 miles away, her suitcase resting beside her boots while steam drifted softly through the cold morning air. Travelers moved quietly around her beneath dim lantern light. Yet despite the noise surrounding her, Clara had never felt more alone. She stared down at the ticket folded in her gloved hands without truly seeing it. Because somewhere deep beneath the ache in her chest, another truth whispered painfully through her heart. Leaving Blackmere Castle had not felt like escaping danger. It had felt like abandoning home. Snow drifted softly beyond the railway station windows while Clara Whitmore sat motionless upon the wooden bench, clutching the edges of her worn coat tightly around herself. The station smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp wool as travelers moved quietly through the early morning fog, carrying suitcases and murmured conversations toward distant destinations. Yet none of it felt real to her. Her ticket rested untouched in her gloved hand. The train had not yet arrived. Part of her prayed it never would. Clara stared through the frosted glass toward the pale winter sky, while memories of Blackmere Castle unfolded painfully through her mind. The warmth returning to cold corridors. The sound of the grandfather clock echoing through silent halls again. Sebastian standing beside the piano, listening to music after years of grief. The way his gray eyes softened each time he looked at her when he thought no one else noticed. She closed her eyes briefly. Leaving had been the right choice. So why did it feel so unbearably wrong? Outside, the distant whistle of an approaching train finally echoed through the snowy valley. Travelers immediately rose from their benches, gathering coats and luggage as steam began rolling across the tracks beyond the station platform. Clara forced herself to stand. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the battered suitcase beside her feet. One more step. That was all it would take to leave Blackmere behind forever. Then suddenly the station doors burst open against the wind. Every sound inside the building seemed to disappear at once. Clara turned instinctively. Sebastian Ravensheyer stood breathless beneath the doorway, snow clinging to his dark coat and raven hair, while cold air rushed violently around him. His chest rose unevenly as though he had ridden through the storm without stopping once. Travelers nearby stared openly now, recognizing immediately that no ordinary man carried such presence into a room. But Sebastian saw none of them. His eyes found Clara instantly across the crowded station, and something raw passed through his expression so openly it stole the breath from her lungs. Relief, fear, love. Clara's fingers loosened against the suitcase handle. Your Grace. Sebastian crossed the station toward her without hesitation, boots striking hard against the wooden floorboards while steam drifted through the open doors behind him. He stopped only inches away, close enough for Clara to see snow melting slowly against the scarred skin of his hand where he had forgotten his gloves entirely. Neither spoke at first. They simply stared at one another while the train whistle echoed again outside. Clara had never seen him like this before. Not controlled, not guarded, just a man terrified of arriving too late. Finally, Sebastian swallowed hard and spoke in a voice roughened by cold and emotion both. I read Evelyn's letter. Clara's breath caught softly. Sebastian lowered his gaze briefly before looking back at her with quiet devastation written plainly across his face. She did not blame me. Clara felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes. Sebastian stepped. Even closer now, his voice barely above a whisper. And the first thing I realized afterward, his scarred hand trembled slightly at his side, was that I could not survive losing you too. The station around them blurred into silence. Travelers moved quietly in the distance while snow continued falling beyond the fog-covered platform. Yet for Clara the entire world narrowed into the exhausted man standing before her with fear and hope fighting openly in his eyes. Sebastian. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud. Something inside him broke softly at the sound. He looked toward the battered suitcase resting beside her feet. The same suitcase she had carried through the storm the night she first arrived at Blackmere Castle, with nothing left in the world except survival itself. Slowly Sebastian bent down and lifted it carefully into his scarred hand. Then he looked back at her. No grand speech. No dramatic promises. Only truth spoken quietly between two wounded hearts standing at the edge of something terrifying and beautiful all at once. "You came to Blackmere with nothing," he said softly. His gray eyes never left hers. "And somehow you became the one thing I cannot replace." Clara felt tears finally escape down her cheeks as the train whistle sounded one last time outside. But neither of them moved toward it. Sebastian simply held her gaze with the stillness of a man who had spent years buried beneath grief and finally understood what it meant to choose life again. Slowly, Clara stepped closer until her trembling hand rested lightly against his coat. Home. That was what she saw in his eyes now. Not a castle, not a title. Him. Outside the station windows, snow continued falling gently across the valley, while somewhere far behind them Blackmere Castle waited beneath the winter sky, with every chandelier lit for the first time in 5 long years.